For decades, the Congo was seen as a distant land of rivers and forests. But behind that silence hides one of the darkest crimes in human history. Millions of innocent people disappeared, not in a great war, but in a system built purely for profit. This is not a legend or a myth. What happened in the Congo is real history, carefully buried under power, politics, and silence. At the end of the 19th century, Europe celebrated progress and civilization. Yet far from its bright cities, a nightmare was unfolding in Central Africa. Villages vanished. Families were torn apart. Children were forced to work until their bodies failed. All of this happened under the rule of a king who never even set foot in the land he controlled. History books often speak of empires and victories, but rarely of the suffering that built them. In the Congo, wealth was created through fear. Hands were cut off. Families were destroyed. Lives were reduced to numbers in profit reports. This is not exaggeration. Every word of this story is based on real events that changed millions of lives forever. Imagine living in a world where your life is worth less than rubber, where your family can be taken at any moment. This was daily reality for millions of Congolese people. A system so cruel that even some of its creators later called it a crime against humanity. Yet for years, this truth was hidden behind royal portraits and heroic statues. While European newspapers praised a king for bringing civilization to Africa, entire communities were being erased in his name. Lies replaced truth. Propaganda replaced justice. What happened in the Congo was not an accident of history. It was a carefully built system of exploitation that destroyed lives and enriched one man beyond imagination. Before Europeans arrived, the Congo was already home to rich cultures, strong communities, and ancient traditions. Kingdoms thrived along the great river, trading and governing themselves for centuries. But in the late 1800s, Africa became the target of a ruthless race for land and resources. What Europeans called exploration was, in reality, a competition for power that would soon change the fate of millions forever. In 1885, the future of Africa was decided in distant European rooms during the Berlin Conference. Borders were drawn without a single African voice being heard. In one shocking decision, the Congo was not given to a nation, but to a man. King Leopold II of Belgium became the personal owner of an enormous land, setting the stage for one of the most brutal systems of exploitation the world had ever seen. To the outside world, Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian leader. He promised to end slavery and bring education and medicine to Africa. Newspapers praised him, churches supported him, and governments trusted him. But behind this carefully built image was a very different truth. Leopold was not interested in saving lives. He was interested in rubber, and the Congo became his private factory of suffering. To enforce his rule, Leopold created a private army known as the Force Publique. Their mission was not protection, but control. Villages were ordered to collect impossible amounts of rubber. Failure meant punishment. Beatings, imprisonment, and even death became common. Families were taken hostage to force men to work harder. Fear ruled the land, and slowly, terror replaced law and justice. As years passed, entire regions of the Congo began to empty. Communities vanished, leaving behind no records and no graves. Yet the wealth kept flowing to Europe. Palaces rose. Statues were built. And the suffering that paid for it all remained hidden behind official reports and beautiful lies. This was not a sudden tragedy, but a slow destruction of a nation under absolute power and greed. As Leopold's control grew stronger, fear became the main tool of power in the Congo. Villages were no longer communities, but labor camps without walls. Men were forced to leave their families for weeks to collect rubber deep in the forests. Those who failed to meet quotas faced public punishment meant to terrify everyone watching. Slowly, fear replaced hope, and silence replaced resistance across the land. In the Congo Free State, human life was no longer measured in dreams or years, but in rubber production. Colonial officers kept records of profits, not people. If a village failed to deliver enough rubber, homes were burned and families were separated. Ordinary citizens became prisoners in their own land, trapped in a system where survival depended on obedience to impossible demands. The violence in the Congo did not destroy only bodies, but entire ways of life. Traditional leaders lost their power. Families were broken apart. Children grew up learning fear before hope. What began as exploitation slowly became something far worse, the systematic destruction of a society. A nation was being reshaped by terror, far from the eyes of the world that benefited from its suffering. For years, the horrors of the Congo remained hidden behind official reports and controlled information. But eventually, the truth began to leak. Missionaries, travelers, and former officials started writing letters and sharing stories of forced labor and mass suffering. At first, few believed them. But as evidence grew, the world could no longer ignore the voices of the victims. When the truth finally reached Europe, it brought an uncomfortable realization. The tragedy of the Congo was not only the work of one cruel ruler, it was also the result of global silence. Governments knew, companies profited, newspapers hesitated. And while people debated in distant capitals, millions continued to suffer. Silence became complicity in one of history's darkest crimes. As reports about the Congo began to spread, a small group of journalists and activists refused to stay silent. They collected letters, photographs, and witness accounts that revealed the truth behind Leopold's rule. Among them were men like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement, who turned public attention toward the suffering in Africa. For the first time, the tragedy of the Congolese people started to reach the conscience of the world. Newspapers slowly began to publish stories that challenged the image of Leopold as a benevolent ruler. Public meetings were organized. Debates filled European cities. What was once whispered in private became discussed in public. People who had never heard of the Congo before were suddenly confronted with stories of forced labor, terror, and mass death. A global movement for justice was beginning to take shape. Despite growing pressure, Leopold continued to deny every accusation. He spent enormous amounts of money on propaganda, hiring writers and officials to protect his reputation. Beautiful words were used to hide brutal realities. But the evidence kept growing, and the voices of the victims could no longer be fully silenced. The image of a noble king slowly began to crack under the weight of undeniable truth. As international outrage increased, governments were forced to take action. Investigations were launched and reports were written that confirmed the worst fears about the Congo Free State. What had once been described as a mission of civilization was now clearly exposed as a system of exploitation and terror. The world was finally beginning to understand that the tragedy in the Congo was not an accident, but a deliberate crime. By the early 1900s, the pressure against Leopold had reached a breaking point. Political leaders could no longer ignore the growing scandal. For the first time, real consequences seemed possible. Yet even as change approached, millions of lives had already been lost. The damage was done, and no decision could bring back the generations destroyed by greed and absolute power. In 1908, after years of pressure and public outrage, Leopold II was finally forced to give up his personal control over the Congo. The territory was transferred to the Belgian government, and many in Europe believed the nightmare was over. But for the Congolese people, this change brought little comfort. The system had changed names, not habits, and the wounds left behind were far deeper than any political decision could heal. Under Belgian rule, some of the worst abuses were reduced, but the damage was already done. Entire communities had disappeared. Families had been torn apart for generations. The economy of the Congo had been built on exploitation rather than growth. What remained was a nation struggling to survive with broken social structures and deep trauma that would shape its future for decades to come. The end of Leopold's rule did not bring justice for the millions who suffered. Very few of those responsible were ever punished. No great trials were held. No full apologies were offered. History moved forward, but the victims were left behind in silence. This lack of accountability sent a dangerous message to the world, that even the greatest crimes could fade without consequences. As time passed, Europe slowly tried to forget what had happened in the Congo. Statues of Leopold still stood in public squares. Streets carried his name. School books spoke more about his projects than his crimes. For decades, the suffering of millions remained hidden behind national pride and selective memory, turning tragedy into a story that few were willing to fully confront. But memory has a way of returning. Historians, activists, and descendants of the victims began to demand that the truth be told. Museums changed their exhibits. Monuments were questioned. Public debates reopened old wounds, but also created space for healing. For the first time in generations, the voices of the Congolese people were slowly being heard again. As the story of the Congo began to resurface in modern times, a new generation started asking difficult questions. Why were these crimes ignored for so long? Why were the victims never fully acknowledged? Universities, documentaries, and independent researchers began uncovering forgotten documents. Slowly, the silence that had protected injustice for decades began to break, and history started to speak with a clearer voice. In Belgium, public debates grew stronger around the legacy of King Leopold II. Some defended him as a man of his time, while others demanded that his statues be removed. For many Congolese descendants, these monuments felt like symbols of pain rather than pride. The struggle over memory became more than history. It became a battle over dignity, truth, and whose voices truly matter. Meanwhile, in the Congo, the consequences of colonial trauma continued to shape everyday life. Political instability, economic struggles, and deep mistrust toward authority did not appear by accident. They were the long echo of a system that taught generations to fear power rather than trust it. The past had never truly ended. It had simply changed form and continued to influence the present. Across the world, human rights organizations began using the Congo as a powerful example of why accountability matters. The tragedy became a warning of what happens when profit is placed above human life. Conferences, books, and public discussions connected this history to modern injustices, reminding people that the lessons of the past are meaningless unless they shape the future. For many years, the Congo genocide was treated as a footnote in history books. But today, it stands as one of the clearest examples of colonial cruelty in the modern world. Remembering this story is not about blaming the past. It is about recognizing patterns of abuse so they are never repeated. Only through truth can real justice begin to take shape. As global awareness grew, schools and universities slowly began to include the Congo tragedy in their history programs. For many students, this was the first time they learned that one of the greatest human disasters of the modern era had been hidden for so long. These lessons challenged comfortable narratives about colonialism and forced a new generation to confront the darker side of progress and power. Documentary filmmakers and writers also played a crucial role in bringing this story to light. Through books, films, and interviews, they gave a voice to those who had been forgotten by official history. Each testimony, each recovered photograph, added another piece to a truth that could no longer be ignored. Slowly, the Congo genocide moved from silence into global memory. For the descendants of the victims, remembering is not only an act of history, but an act of survival. Many families still carry stories passed down through generations about loss, fear, and resilience. These memories keep alive a past that the world once tried to erase. By telling these stories today, they reclaim dignity from a system that once tried to strip it away. Across Europe, public pressure continued to grow for official recognition of the crimes committed in the Congo. Some governments began to issue statements of regret, while activists demanded stronger actions, including reparations and formal apologies. Though these steps came late, they represented an important shift from denial to responsibility and from silence to accountability. As the world reflects on the tragedy of the Congo, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest danger is not only cruelty, but forgetting. When history is buried, injustice finds new ways to return. Remembering what happened in the Congo is more than honoring the past. It is a warning to the future about what happens when power is left without conscience. In recent years, the story of the Congo has gained new attention through social movements and digital media. Young voices across the world began sharing forgotten histories, challenging old narratives, and demanding justice for the past. What was once hidden in archives is now discussed openly online, proving that even after a century, truth still has the power to change how societies see themselves. For many people, learning about the Congo genocide creates a deep sense of responsibility. It raises difficult questions about privilege, power, and silence. How many other tragedies remain hidden today? How many voices are still unheard? Remembering the Congo is not only about honoring victims, but about recognizing our role in shaping a future where such crimes can no longer exist unnoticed. History shows that cruelty often survives when people believe it is not their problem. In the Congo, distance allowed suffering to continue for years without serious challenge. Today, technology connects the world more than ever, yet indifference can still spread just as easily. The lesson remains clear. Awareness must lead to action, or history risks repeating itself in new forms. As this story reaches its end, we are left with more than facts and dates. We are left with a moral choice. The past cannot be changed, but its meaning can. By choosing to remember the Congo genocide, we choose to stand against silence and denial. We choose to honor lives that were once treated as invisible. The tragedy of the Congo is not just a chapter in history books. It is a reminder of what happens when power has no limits and humanity has no voice. Millions suffered, not because the world did not know, but because it chose not to act in time. May this story never be forgotten, and may it guide us toward a future where justice matters more than profit.